Suspension System Training Coach course, Suspension Training Exercises, Part 1, Upper Body Exercises. So Part 2, well, this presentation is going to look at the pressing movement exercises and the supplementary exercises associated with this movement or muscles involved. So we're going to be looking at horizontal pressing, upward pressing, downward pressing, and then horizontal flexion of the shoulder and elbow extension to work your triceps. So the first exercise we'll look at is the suspension system chest press. So we call this, we call it a chest press when the hands are in the handle. We call it a press up when the feet are in the straps or in the handles. So this exercise is going to be a horizontal pressing movement. So it's going to be working the chest, the pectorals, the triceps. It's also going to be working the rotator cuff and the anterior core muscles. It works the rotator cuff because it's the rotator cuff in particular that are trying to stabilize the movement of the handles. So when your hands are on a solid object like the floor, when you do a press up, there's still going to be rotator cuff activation, but it's not really that unstable. It's quite fixed. When you're in this more kind of open chain kind of exercise, what we have with this chest press, the rotator cuff are trying to control the upwards and downwards movement of the straps side to side, and this kind of rotational wax on, wax off type of movement. And it's the rotator cuff in particular that are there to stabilize. And so because it's so unstable, they're really going to increase their level of involvement. The anterior core is also involved because unlike like a kind of seated or supine chest press, because we're in a more prone position like a plank, the anterior core is going to be significantly more activated. In order to keep the hips from sagging and the lower back from overarching, you need to keep the body rigid, and you do that by bracing the core and the glutes. The other thing we tend to coach is to focus on pushing upwards ever so slightly as you do the pressing movement and push the chest away from the straps. If you push up very slightly, like an inch or two, that'll help to keep the straps from rubbing on the upper arm, on the shoulders, as you kind of do that press movement. If you press downwards, then that rubbing tends to get worse. For regression, make it easier, move the feet forwards to make the body more vertical, and for progression, you move the feet backwards in order to make the body more horizontal. Again, depending on the length of the straps as well, we can also increase the length of the straps, and that will also, again, make the body angle more horizontal to make it harder. Here we see this in action then. So this is more of your kind of wide grip position. Elbows going out to the side. So we start from there. We allow the elbows to bend, hands move out to the side, and the chest lowers down in between the hands. Keep the core nice and braced and the glutes nice and braced in order to protect the back. And you should, when you feel this on your core, you should always feel it on the anterior core. If you feel it on the posterior core and your lower back, then you need to focus on bracing more or making the exercise easier. For variations, well, we can look at more of a close grip, so palms kind of facing inwards, elbows staying a lot closer. So a little less pectoral involvement, a little bit more triceps, a little bit more shoulder stability. And again, if you do find the straps are rubbing a little bit, you can always just move the anchors a little bit further away, and that will help to prevent that rubbing occurring. And here we have our chest fly. So pretty much the opposite of the reverse fly that we did on the previous presentation. Body nice and rigid, palms facing each other, and the hands maintaining a very slight elbow bend usually. Hands move out to the side into this abducted position. This is a very tough exercise, so a lot of people do feel it on the shoulder and obviously on the kind of pecs, but it's a bit of a Marmite exercise. Some people like it, some people are really not that keen. Again, you can use it as a variation. It's obviously a bit more of an isolation exercise for the pectoral muscles, but it is quite a tough exercise for a lot of people to perform. And then we have our press up. So as we said, we call it press up when the feet are suspended in the system. Again, going to be working the chest, triceps, anterior core muscles. You are going to get less rotator cuff activation than you did with the suspension chest press. Key thing with this, you need to make sure you can perform a stable press up first. There's no point trying to perform a press up on an unstable surface like a suspension system if you can't do it on a stable surface in the same body angle and lever length. So if you can't do a full press up, it's not suddenly going to get any better when you put your feet on an unstable surface. Coaching side, you want to keep the body rigid by bracing the core and glutes, as we said previously. Progression, well, we can move forwards, which will increase the core stabilization because the straps will try and pull you back, so you will have to use your anterior core a little bit more to stabilize there. Other variations or progressions, we could vary the hand position. You can also do it with just one leg in the strap and the other foot kind of hanging in space, which we'll show you in a minute. You can also walk backwards, and that starts to elevate the feet up, so you start to get into more of an inclined press-up position. And we'll have a look at each of these now. So your standard press-up with the feet suspended. Pop both the feet into the straps. You want the straps about 10-12 inches approximately off the ground. Move yourself forward, knees on the ground, and then when you're ready, brace the core, lift the knees off the ground, and then we form our standard press-up movement. Mark's doing it with elbows somewhat closer. Others among you may want to have your elbows a little bit wider. It's a bit of variation and or style preference. So variations, well, we could do like we'll call a T press up. So you do your press up and then you come up into a T position, lift one hand off the ground, rotate it upwards towards the ceiling. And we can do that when we perform all the reps on one side or alternating sides with each repetition. You do need a two strap system to do this. If you do this with a single strap system, then as you kind of shift your weight from off one strap and onto the other, then you will find that the feet will jump up, or one will jump up and one will jump down. So it's not really that comfortable with a single strap system. You really need to use a two strap system for this to work. Other variations, well, we've got this Spider-Man press up. So just as kind of per normal, we bring one knee up to one elbow. And again, we can do it all on one side or alternate sides with each repetition. A little bit easier, I'd kind of say, than freestanding because you're still pressing downwards on the strap. But again, for exercise variation, it's a nice little change from a standard press up. And with all the kind of the press ups, we can add some of the core movements to them. So we can do them as a bit of a combination movement. So in this complex, in this case, we're doing a press up and then adding a jackknife movement to it. And we'll show you some variety of these different core exercises in the core presentation. But if we want to do them as a complex, then there's lots we can add to it. Jackknife with rotation, pike, etc. So we do one repetition of a press up and then one repetition of the core movement. So I mentioned it earlier, I've got a single leg press up variation. So what you do here is you place a single leg into the strap with the other foot or leg held above the ground. This is going to increase the transverse stability required. So again, just like when you do a plank and you lift one hand off the ground, your body wants to rotate and you have to control that rotation. We get the same thing when one foot is lifted out of the straps. As a result, you're going to get more core and anterior hip activation. So in particular, it's the anterior hip on the side, so whichever leg's in the straps, and as you see in the image, it's the right foot in the strap. That right hip flexor is going to have to do more work in order to stabilize. As a progression from a kind of single leg press up, we see that here, but now what we're also doing is we're adding a leg sweep in between each repetition. So once you can do your kind of single leg press up, these types of variations can be added in order, again, to increase the difficulty of the exercise. In retrospect, what I do is kind of move the other strap so it doesn't get in the way with each repetition. Other press up variations, so we can do what we call these kind of inclined press ups. So what we do here is you walk backwards so that the feet elevate upwards. And what this does is when you do the pressing movement, it's effectively like you're kind of doing a half horizontal press and a half upward press, so effectively an inclined press. It does make it harder. There is one main consideration with this, which is just how high should you go. So you do want to be careful, as we see with the image now, when you're going too far upwards into a handstand position. So Mark, the model there, is quite accomplished at this type of stuff. But the problem is, as you get into this kind of vertical body position, the risk of injury does increase significantly, particularly if you then do a set of these kind of handstand type of press ups. With your feet in the straps, it's quite difficult to actually get out. So if you do fatigue and your arms want to give way, you can't really kind of bail out of the exercise at all. In particular, when your feet, both feet are up in that position, if you do kind of shift to the side laterally, again, it's very difficult, if not near impossible, to actually get your feet out to kind of save yourself, and so your legs kind of get flung out to the side. In my opinion, I would say the risk of the exercises outweighs the kind of benefit of doing this particular movement. So generally we tend to kind of discourage this kind of fully handstand-esque position. So we're looking at the suspension system overhead tricep extension. So this is effectively a body weight suspension equivalent of the kind of behind the neck tricep extension exercise. French press, some people call it. So it's going to be working the elbow extensors, triceps. Coaching side, you want to keep the elbows up and the upper arms still. And when you're performing the movement, you bend the elbows to lower the head in between the straps so the hands kind of finish up either side and behind the head. Regression, in order to make the exercise easier, a couple of things you do. You can perform it on the knees, which will decrease the lever length, but also you can flex the hips more. To make it harder, you can perform it standing, so increasing the lever length, and you can do it with the hips extended forward. Now, whether you flex or extend the hips kind of depends on where you want to overload, what part of the body you want to kind of work a little bit harder. When we flex the hips, as you see Mark in the image there has got his hips slightly flexed, that allows us to decrease the core requirements, and therefore we can kind of overload the triceps a little bit more. When you extend the hips forward into a nice plank-like position, you can increase the requirements of the core and therefore kind of decrease the kind of triceps slightly. So it kind of depends which way you want to swing the emphasis. More hip flexed, more triceps, more hips extended, more core. So here we see this being performed in a kneeling position. And again, whether you're kneeling or standing, we can do it hip flexed or hips extended. So start with the arms extended in front of the head, keep the elbows up, allow the arms to bend, and the hands will finish off behind the head. Now you can keep the wrists, the palms facing downwards. Both Mark and I prefer to kind of allow the handles to rotate. Naturally, I just find it more comfortable to perform it that way. You can do it either way, depends on what you find most comfortable. And we can also then do this in a standing position. So we see here exactly the same kind of movement. And again, if you focus on the upper arm, that humerus is, we're trying to maintain its kind of position. So we don't want the elbows to move significantly. We want to try to focus on it being almost a pure elbow extension exercise. Bend the hips more, push the hips back. You're going to get more overload on the triceps. Get into a more horizontal position, you're going to put more overload on the triceps. And here we have our pike shoulder press. So we're going to go through the pike again in the core movement presentation. But effectively what you do is you keep your legs straight, lift your hips up and forward so they're over the shoulders, and then we perform this shoulder press movement in this kind of upside down position. Mark, as you can see, is kind of resetting with each repetition. Some people prefer to keep the hips up there and just bat out multiple repetitions with the hips elevated. Again, either of those variations are perfectly acceptable. We usually tend to kind of reset between each repetition if you fatigue quite easily in that area. And then we have some quite challenging exercises. This one is what we call kind of pre-support position. Effectively, it's like holding the top position of a tricep dip. This is going to be working the shoulders, triceps, scapular stabilizer muscles. On the coaching side, you want to keep the shoulders held downwards, so effectively the scapula depressed, in order to prevent your shoulders from hitching up or elevating. You also want to keep the chest up, the body rigid, and ideally, as a good coaching cue, having your head up rather than, as you see in the image, heads down. Head up also helps with that as well. On the regression side, again, just like the kind of press up, you need to be able to really perform this on a stable surface before you start progressing onto an unstable surface. There's no point doing it on an unstable suspension system if you can't do it on a stable surface like dip bars. it's just going to be way too difficult. So make sure you can do it on dip bars, almost like a screening exercise then. And if you can do that, then we can look to progress you on to these unstable gymnastic rings or suspension systems. If you want to make it harder, we can move the arms outwards from the body. So when you keep your hands real close to the body, it's a bit more stable. Allow the hands to move away from the torso, significantly increases the instability. And doing the same type of thing, you can also pull the anchors slightly further apart. As you can see, kind of from the image on the right hand side, the anchors are relatively kind of close, and so what that means is the straps kind of hold on to the shoulders, makes it a bit more stable. If we were to move those apart kind of half a foot, you'd find that instability of that exercise would increase greatly. And that pre-support position effectively is the key screening or prerequisite exercise in order to be able to perform something like suspension system dips. Again, it's going to be working the shoulder, triceps, a lot more on the kind of triceps now, and the scapular stabilizer muscles. On the coaching side, again, shoulders should be held down to avoid hitching. And when you're doing the dips, you want to allow the torso to lean forward as you bend the arms into that bottom position. That's a normal thing to try to decrease the stress on the anterior capsule of the shoulder. Again, regression, there is no point trying to perform dips on an unstable suspension system if you can't do them on a stable surface like dip bars. If you want to make the exercise again harder, again, just like we mentioned on the previous exercise, you can look to move the anchors further apart. It does require significant control of your rotator cuff muscles. So if you have a weak rotator cuff, or kind of you're rehabbing from a rotator cuff injury, this type of exercise you'd want to avoid like the plague. Now the last exercise we'll discuss are suspension system muscle ups. So we tend to see these being performed, as we see with images there, with gymnastic rings. And this is an advanced gymnastic move, very popular amongst the kind of CrossFitters. And effectively it's a pull up and then straight into a dip movement. So we call it a complex pull up into dip exercise. Most users that use a kind of go into a gym do not have either the mobility, the stability, or the strength in order to perform this exercise safely. So for the majority of users in a gym, we tend to avoid this exercise. Most suspension system anchors are also not high enough to really accommodate the movement. So because what we need to have enough clearance so that you can perform the dip part, i.e. you can do the full dip, come up and not bang your head on the anchor system. It also requires that they're high enough so that when you're hanging down to do the pull-up, there's enough room so you're not touching the floor. And even with that high anchor system, as you see with the image there, he's still not really, on the left-hand side image, he's still not high enough so he could free hang without his feet touching the ground. It's a good exercise, like I said, commonly used with kind of CrossFit. But for a lot of people, just doing pull-ups, just doing dips, particularly hard enough. If you do want to progress into this exercise, we'd recommend you actually get a gymnastics coach to teach you how to do it safely. So here we have a couple of sessions that you can practice in order to look to kind of apply these exercises within an actual session. So in this one, we're combining the pulling and pressing movements. So we're going to be doing a close grip row, about 30 seconds worth of work, 15 seconds rest, paired with a suspension system chest press. Now you can perform these where we do the rows, do that for 30 seconds, and then we do the chest press, or you could do it where you perform all 3 sets of the chest press, then all 3 sets of the row, and then move on. It's up to you. Take a couple of minutes rest, and then we're pairing up the press up with the L rows and bicep curls with tricep extensions. These are on the kind of the resource list on the module on the learner management system as well. And the second session, we're combining reverse flies or T-pulls with a chest fly, press up with a jackknife with these wide grip rows, bear hug bicep curls with these pre-support holds. So again, take yourself through these sessions. What we recommend is you do the exercises first, and then once you've mastered the technique of the exercises, then look to apply them into an actual working session. So to review the objectives of this module, we're to give an overview of the upper body suspension system training exercises within this course, provide coaching points and application for each exercise or variation, and provide guided practice for the exercises and give some example upper body sessions for you to follow. You should perform the guided learning hours for this section, which is a couple of hours of guided practice of the exercises. The list is on the management system, and then you can take yourself through these upper body sessions again for a couple of hours. Take yourself through the list of exercises first, and then once you're happy with those, then go through the example upper body sessions. You want to log the guided learning hours for your online submission, and then do the review questions, and then move on to the next presentation.